Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole. Today's guest, Shellye Archambeau, is a Fortune 500 board member with 17 years of public board experience. Currently, she sits on the boards of Verizon, Roper Technologies, Okta, and Catalyst. Shellye is also an advisor and former CEO, latterly, of MetricStream. She has recently written a book, Unapologetically Ambitious: Take Risks, Break Barriers, and Create Success on Your Own Terms. Shellye, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Oliver.
I want to kick off talking about your first board position because you took your first on whilst you were still an executive. And there's a nice piece actually that came out of a group of McKinsey partners. It was a book where they were looking at the highest performing CEOs. And one of the characteristics they identified was that the CEOs had one independent board role. And so I always encourage people to do this because I think it gives them a different perspective on their role and makes them better at their role, as well as being an enjoyable experience in of itself. But I'm fascinated to hear how you thought about that decision to take on a board role alongside your CEO role, because many CEOs say, I haven't got time.
Yes, it was actually interesting, Oliver, in that I knew there was a board of directors, right, for each company, but I really didn't know early in my career what the board did, if that was actually a job, right, et cetera. None of that really came to light until I was in my early 30s. And then I learned, oh, wait, the board hires and fires the CEO? I had already decided I wanted to be a CEO, but now I added that to my career aspirations as well. I was like, okay, I want that job too. So I actually aspired to be a board director, not realizing or even knowing around how it could affect my CEO career. But I did the research, and the research all showed, skills, what backgrounds, experience, what boards look for. And the number one requirement for getting a board seat on a good public board seemed to be board experience. And I was like, okay, this is a conundrum, right? How does that work? So I decided that, all right, good news is I want to be a CEO, and having CEO experience is actually very valued. So terrific. What I'll do is I'll get my CEO role, and then as soon as I get my arms around becoming CEO, then I'm going to go after a board seat. That way I'll be able to build this experience so that when I'm ready to serve on boards for a career, I'll have experience. So I did. So I took over, I became CEO of MetricStream when I was 40. I took on my first public board, which was Arbitron. I think it was about 43. And the good news is, you're absolutely right. Being on a board absolutely helped me with my CEO role and managing my own board.
Can you bring that to life for me a little bit with some examples? In what ways did it help you become a better CEO?
So first of all, it just gave me a perspective and an understanding of what board members are looking for and of how when they come into a board meeting, you're living your company every single day. And your board is your board. So you think, in essence, okay, so they are too. Well, they're really not, right? They come in, they pay attention, et cetera, but they don't know it as well as you. So it's everything from, let's get rid of the acronyms, or make sure we have a glossary, because what I find is every company has its own language. Second, one of the things the CEO did was talk about right at the beginning, what's working, what's not, what's going well, what's not. And that was really helpful as a board member to get that context in that setting. And I said, so I brought that into my CEO report. Okay, what's working, what's not, right? Where are we focused, et cetera. So that was helpful, and my board appreciated it. One of the other things was just around strategy. So we had our strategy discussions. We talked about market, competition, how we're positioned, right? All those things, and here's what we're planning to do. But I hadn't been spending much time talking about scenario planning around risks, et cetera, that could come up around the overall strategy, as much as I saw in terms of on this other board. But honestly, Oliver, I kept bringing all kinds of things in. You don't even realize, frankly, all that you're learning and bringing to the table.
Brilliant. So you talk there, so content to include in the board, how to approach strategy. How did it impact on your time and your sort of stretch time? One of my observations is the highest performing execs always seem to have more time available than other people. But how did you ever feel like, this is not something I need right now, or were you always able to fit it in and accommodate the time that was required?
I'm a big believer in ruthless prioritization. So I always had the time. This was a very valuable experience for me. So therefore, it becomes a matter of, okay, so where am I taking it from, right? How am I going to create time? And one of the things that have learned as I've risen in my career is one of the best things you can do as a leader is make fewer and fewer decisions the higher up you get. So by making fewer and fewer decisions, you're in essence forcing and therefore encouraging and developing your team to make more decisions, to take more ownership, to do, right? All those things, which can then give you the ability to, frankly, better delegate because they're building up better and stronger strengths. But at the end of the day, no, there was never a point where I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to drop this board because I just don't have the time. I thought it was key to my own development and to my own overall performance as a CEO. So there would be other things that I would give up before that.
Okay, really interesting. One of the things I do actually as a CEO, inspired by actually it was an HBR piece where they talked about again the highest performing CEOs map out their time on a sort of monthly basis and allocate time to it. I don't know whether that's something that you did, but how much time did you allocate in your mind across your, an average 168-hour, week? How much time did you allocate to that independent board role?
The board role itself took up, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it took up less than 10% of what I was doing. It's more like 5 to 7%, right, in terms of overall time. Mainly because as CEO, you're always on, so you're working a whole lot. But anyway, that's really how I said it. And by the way, I completely agree with you with regards to calendar. That was one of the best pieces of advice I ever received was to manage my calendar. And I remember getting it, and that was the time I was, I don't know, probably like a director level, and someone had said, no, it's really important for you to manage your calendar. And I thought, manage my calendar? My calendar is being set by everybody else, right? Bosses set up meetings, people set up meetings. I mean, what do you mean manage my calendar? I thought it was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. And then thinking about it, moving forward a whole bit, I realized exactly how important that was because I'm an intentional person anyway. So I said, all right, let me figure this out. And and I encourage other people to do that who felt like me. First thing to do is to actually go back. So every quarter, I look at my calendar the past 3 months and say, am I spending the time consistent with my priorities? Right? Very simple. Am I spending the time consistent with priorities? And I was surprised when I first started doing this. I really wasn't. I was spending it based on everybody else's priorities. So anyway, I agree with you. I think that's actually a really key that everyone can take to improve their overall productivity, efficiency, and impact.
Yeah, it reminds me, I remember when someone once said, to-do list is what you want to do, your inbox is what other people want you to do, and your calendar is what you end up doing. So, focus on your calendar, which I've certainly found really, really helpful. So you took on this first board role. Tell me about how, you sound incredibly intentional in the way that you go about things. I imagine you took a pretty intentional approach to how, once you got that role, how you went about developing your skill set as a non-exec.
Sure. Well, the first thing I did before I even joined the board was I talked to people who served on boards and that I felt were probably pretty good at what they did to get their advice. What's your advice? I'm getting ready to join the board. What's your advice? So when I joined Arbitron, they asked me what committee I was interested in participating on, and I said the audit committee. Because one of my mentors has said, join the audit committee. I'm like, audit? I mean, oh my gosh, right? I mean, that's so heavy lifting the whole bit. And I'm CEO. And they were like, nope, if you join the audit committee, you'll learn how the company actually makes money. Not where the revenue comes from, not where the growth comes from, but how they actually make money. And if you understand how they actually make money, you'll be better in your advice and your counsel around strategy. So, okay, that's what I did. So I've done that every time. So every time I join a board, I join the audit committee. I don't always stay on it, but I join it to begin with.
That's really interesting. So tell me how you go about that process, because I've certainly seen some audit committees where that's not what they're doing. So I'm curious to understand your experience and how you use audit committees, because I've seen
Right.
some that can be, quite box ticking in the way that they go about these things, very dry, more, and often you sort of see it when you've got former auditors involved, and they're sort of much more technical. So it sounds like you brought a very sort of commercial lens to it.
Yeah. So what I mean when I say you learn how they actually make money, yes, you're still going through the P and L and the balance sheet and the whole bit, but because you are and in detail, you can see what I call revenue that's empty calories. What I mean by empty calories is, yeah, revenue that comes in, but frankly, the dollars to get that revenue, it goes right out. So it looks great because you're growing revenue, but you're not growing profit. When I say how they make money, I'm talking about understanding how things flow. So when you say it's technical, yeah, I think it's very technical. You actually spend time going through and understanding how all this comes together. You see how capital is spent, right? Return on capital. You see, I mean, all those things. So the fact that you're actually living in that audit committee, yes, there's a lot of things that don't have to do with that, but the fact that you're in the audit committee, you're looking at the numbers, you're seeing what flows because they highlight, right? They highlight, all right, what's happened with this quarter, right? They don't just say, here's the revenue, here's the expense, here's the whatever. They say, oh, our margins are up because blah, 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 right? Our margins are down because of blah, 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 blah. So you start to learn what is really driving the overall business. But the key is it's the lens that you bring to it, right? So if you walk in saying, what I want to understand is how we actually make money, and that informs the questions that you ask. So if you're not understanding, you're asking questions, right? To understand. And that's the format. You don't ask those kinds of questions in the board meeting, in the board room, not in terms of that detail. So it allows you to learn faster, right? That overall set of dynamics. Does that make sense, Oliver?
So it reminds me of, I came from an investment background. We always used to have, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash flow, reality. And as an investor, I always used to take that atomic approach of making sure I could understand the unit economics from a bottom up, completely discombobulate the organization and understand every little thing to then rebuild it up. And then once you've done that, you have, a much greater understanding of, as you say, the sort of the strategic impact of different initiatives, rather than just getting the glossy version of the whatever's happening on the surface. So you talked. I love that, the sort of the strategy of going to the audit committee as a great way to enrich your learning journey as a non-exec. What else did you do? I'm pretty sure that wouldn't have been the only thing that you would have done. How else did you think about that learning?
That was getting the industry. The first board I joined was Arbitron. Arbitron was a media ratings and research company. Okay, I was in tech. I was not in media. So this is a new space for me. So therefore, it's starting to read up and understand what's going on. You set up the Google alert for the company. So anytime something's happening, you're kind of seeing what's going on. But it's trying to get the contextual, right? I'm not going to become an expert. And they didn't bring me on the board to be an expert in their industry. So that's the other thing to remember. I don't have to become an expert. I'm just trying to understand the context so that when I'm hearing things and when I have ideas, right, I can understand how they could potentially apply so that what I say is relevant versus being completely irrelevant. That's the purpose. So yes, doing the research, I call it doing the homework to get ready, is important. Obviously, they send you all the decks right in advance. It's making sure you actually read it, but don't just read it. Think about, so what are your questions upon reading it? Literally ask yourself, if you read the whole thing and you have no questions, you haven't read it properly. Because there's no way, no way you can talk through and review all that's going on with the company over that period and not have any questions.
Do you have a strategy for going through a board pack? When I go through a board pack, I'll normally have hundreds of questions, and then I will end up filtering them down, figuring out, okay, like if I'm only going to ask 3 or whatever, these are going to be the 3, or these are the key themes that I think are really important that we focus on. What's your strategy to ensuring you're as effective as you can be with the questions that you ask?
I jot down my questions. Many times the questions get answered, right, in terms of as you go through, which is good. So the good news is all my boards today use electronic, either Diligent or Boardvantage or something. So I literally just write them with my pencil, right? I have a pencil on all this stuff. And then once I've gone through it once, then because you can look at what pages you actually marked, and then go back and say, okay, what questions actually weren't answered, right, as I went through this thing. And what's important. Sometimes some questions I'll actually send before the meeting. If I think something's confusing, I'll actually send a note to whatever executive is that's responsible for that area and just say, I was reading such and such, and I was confused by blah, blah, blah. I'm probably not the only one. When you present, you might think about including X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, I'll do that kind of thing. And first of all, management totally appreciates that. I was the CEO. I totally would appreciate that. So yeah, do that. So you still get your question answered, right? And you get it highlighted a whole bit. And some things I think, all right, it's not so much to do it differently. I just have a question. So this is fine because I think everybody would be engaged. So 2 different buckets. What I want to ask in advance. If I think something's confusing, I think it'll put either the executive of the company in a light that says either they weren't prepared, or they weren't thinking it through, or they weren't whatever. Then I tell the company in advance. If it's just a discussion point, right? Clarification, then that I'll ask in the meeting itself.
That's an area I thought we'd be thinking about a lot in a sort of post-COVID world where, a reason for meeting in person has maybe shifted quite a lot. And I ask myself a lot, what is the purpose of meetings and in person as opposed to remotely, or writing things asynchronously, writing them down on paper through a sort of Google Doc or whatever with a series of comments? What for you are the key questions to raise in the meeting itself versus that can be addressed asynchronously? And you've talked about the bucket there of those where it's, you just want to clarify, or you think something hasn't been covered. But there are also questions where it's not necessarily clarification, but actually would be better addressed asynchronously anyway versus in the meeting itself?
Questions in the meeting are when I think it'd be helpful for the board as a whole, right, to have the context or the understanding. Because if you're doing it asynchronously, I'm getting educated, but just me, right?
But you could do it in a Google Doc or some sort of shared document, depending on what system you're using.
Yeah, but we don't have that. Yeah, we don't really create kind of this shared, docs and things. There's so much for people to digest, right? Kind of in review, creating a whole nother space where, okay, read all this, but then also pay attention to what's happening here all the time. I mean, again, people are busy. You want to keep board members focused. I haven't seen for that very effective. Effective for management, not necessarily for board that I'm on.
That's really interesting. So if you had the opportunity to do that, it sounds like you wouldn't actually want to do that. Why is that different for the management versus the board, do you think? Is it just a question of time, available time, or?
No, it's focus. Management is 100% in on this company, and that's it. Board members have a variety. They might have 3 or 4 companies or more. If they're nonprofits, the whole that they're engaged in, they may have an operating job already. They're not in there checking every moment, right, to pay attention to what's happening and what's going on. So very much need to be led and fed, right, versus creating something that says, hey, always pay attention to what's happening here. And you don't want to send anything that's board related outside of a protected environment.
Absolutely. Okay. You've also taken on a couple of roles in the not-for-profit space. Now, I will often encourage people to take on pro bono roles because I think it's a brilliant thing to do on a personal level. They're significantly less competitive on the platform. At least on average, we get something like 10 applications per non-profit role, whereas we probably get 40 for the commercial paid roles. So if you're looking to get your first board role, it's an easier place to start. And then I think often when you come to applying for those paid roles, it shows someone you understand what it is to operate on a board and be non-executive, and it gives them someone they can reference. But I'd be interested to hear what you've taken out of those pro bono roles and how you've thought about taking them on.
I completely agree with you. I think it's a great place to start. I took on my first nonprofit board role in my late 20s. So I've been serving on nonprofit board roles forever. And a couple things. One, even though it's definitely different than serving on a for-profit company board, whether it's private or public, it does help you begin to understand kind of the role of governance, right? The role of how to communicate and be effective in a group where people are coming together. Again, different perspectives, different backgrounds, but all with the intent of trying to help and support the overall company. So I think it helps you just to build a confidence that when you ultimately serve on a for-profit board, you come in with a bit more confidence.
Got it. Makes a lot of sense. Now, when you look at your portfolio as a whole of board roles, do you have sort of archetypes within your portfolio where you like to have a mix of a certain type, or how have you thought about that overall construction?
Mhm. So on the for-profit side, I look at board roles as areas where I want to be able to contribute, but I also want to be able to learn. And I want to spend time like I like to spend time. So I like disruption. I like challenge. So I enjoy working with companies that are going through transformation, and then I want to learn things. So I enjoy being in different kinds of companies. So I spent my whole career in tech, and first thing I did was a media company. I did a retail company. I'm now doing a call it telecommunications right slash tech company with Verizon. Roper has a model for buying companies and helping to make them better, and using the profits that come to buy more companies. They grow through acquisition, very different model. So I have one tech, right, of all of them. But the reason is I want to learn personally, and then I want to be able to obviously contribute. So all of these companies are areas that I can contribute because in their own way, they're all transforming and evolving, and tech is a key enabler, right, for all that. So that's how I look at it. I wouldn't want to do a bunch of the same type of company.
Really helpful. That you talked at the beginning about that catch-22 situation where you get told to get a board role, you need a board role. I remember a lady called Terry Duhon, who was one of our first guests on the podcast, talking about exactly that, and she sort of talked about her journey where she went and wrote a book, interestingly, and then sort of got a associate professorship, and then got her first board role. And she sort of talked about effectively how she transformed her profile and made herself stand out as a thought leader in the space. How have you thought about that differentiation of yourself as a board member that's allowed you to, take on so many different roles? It's a challenge I sometimes hear from people where they say, look, I've got a board role, but how do I now start to move across? And it's one thing to get the first one because you just stand out in a particular area, but then to migrate across, what was your approach to that?
The first thing is you have to be a really good board member, because the most likely place that you will get the next one is referrals from board members that you're serving with. When people say, hey, do you know anybody? They're like, you know what? There's somebody serves on my board, blah, 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 blah. So the first thing you do is you perform. So you make sure that you're really good at what you do. And the second is figure out what you stand for, right, in the boardroom. So everybody's bringing a different perspective, should be bringing a different perspective. And who are you, right? So when people say, okay, so, tell me about Shellye, what do they say? So I think it's important to pick a major, what I call it. Pick a major. Pick something you're going to focus on. I decided for me it's governance, which makes sense. I ran a company that was governance, risk, and compliance. I know the space. Every board has a governance and nominating committee. So that's the committee that I tend to join. And right now I chair. The other thing is skill set. So that's kind of an experience that I bring and skill set. But the other is tech, right? It's tech and element, how to leverage the industry. So making sure that that's also an area that I always stay up to date and know what's going on, right? That I can bring that point of view. And then I tell people, stay in your lane. And what I mean by stay in your lane is this sounds a little cheeky, but the companies want to know what you know. They don't really care about what you think. So we all, because of what we've done, we all have opinions. They're coming up with a marketing campaign. Well, we're all consumers, so we all feel we're marketing experts. Everybody wants to weigh in, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, that resonates a huge amount. Actually, it has parallels with those. I don't know if you've come across, I think it's Michael Bungay-Stanier's advice monster concept, and I think he's written a book, but also a podcast, a TED talk on it, where he says you should never give advice, and there are three reasons. One is you probably haven't understood the problem. If you have understood the problem, you probably don't know the right solution. And if you have understood the problem and you do know the right solution, by letting that other person know that you're sort of effectively better than them by giving them that advice, they're not going to listen to you anyway. And of course, we all think we know that. We know we shouldn't give advice. but somehow like our advice is different. And it strikes me, we do these mastermind sessions for our board community, where we have this model that we follow where people basically share a challenge, people get the opportunity to ask clarifying questions, and then once they've understood the problem, they share experiences they've had. And what amuses me hugely is how really seasoned board members just feel this massive urge to weigh in with advice, or what I call quagestions, which are suggestions dressed up as questions. And it's just remarkable how difficult a thing that is to do. And I'm curious actually to understand how you think about that, walking that line between, asking those good questions versus actually sometimes giving people a clear steer. Because I think your point around staying in your lane resonates so much. But how do you strike that balance between the question and the advice?
The way I give advice, because boards, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the company knows. There's no way I can know as much as management knows, right? So I never say, go do this. I don't have the context. But I would say, I'd strongly consider blah, 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 right? And here's why. But just see if that's something that might make sense, right? So that I will do. But no, I never give directives, right? Or say you should do this or you should do that, because people don't have the context. But I do give things that people should consider, because frankly, there is some pattern recognition to certain elements, certain situations, right, that are being faced. So that it's okay. But 90% of what I say, at least I work really hard, so it's at least 90%. It's all in question and real question.
Yeah, fantastic. Just going back to what you were saying earlier and flipping on its head a little bit, you were talking about majoring in an area. Could you think of board members that you work with where there are things that they do that stand out for you, where if you were asked, are they any good, or who's a good board member, you would say yes, and because of X, Y, and Z. What is that X, Y, and Z without necessarily embarrassing any individuals? What are the things that stand out for you as you think about board member performance?
I think it's wonderful when board members are able and do ask questions that truly uncover a way of thinking about something or getting to the heart, right, of the issue. Because that's always the hard thing. You're dealing up here with problems, opportunities, challenges. And we're dealing up here. It's all about how do you actually get to the crux, to the roots, right, to what have you. When board members are able to actually ask the questions that actually get there, to me, that's always impressive. Because the faster you can do that, the more effective, right, you are in the boardroom itself. And so that comes from a number of places, which is why it always goes back to, share what you know and not what you think. Because typically it's when you really have knowledge, right, and when you're really bringing your your skill set to it, that you're able to do that and bring a perspective that others hadn't seen or realized.
Super powerful. Share what you know or what you think. I'm going to take that with me, ringing in my ears. I want to move on to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome, which is one of the things that I regularly hear actually from some of the board members participating in our mastermind groups, and that they experience some form of imposter syndrome. And I'm always surprised and amazed, but also delighted by it. And I think actually the more I've seen of it, the more I see it as a hallmark of someone with a growth mindset who's constantly questioning themselves. And it's it's part of their superpower, that they're constantly dissatisfied and uncertain, and, both a blessing and a curse, I guess, sometimes difficult to live with, but it's what gives them that, relentless curiosity. But I'm really interested because you've written about this in your book and suggest that amazingly you are one of those people who continue to experience it. Can you bring that to life, maybe with an example and where you've sort of experienced it badly?
I experienced it throughout my whole career. So we talk about boards. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So really, here I am talking about Everton being my first board. Well, when I went to that interview, I had a great conversation with the CEO. And I knew it was great, and I knew that he was going to be moving me forward because he was the first one, and then you go talk to the head of non-exec. So now I'm having a meeting with the chair of the board, and I am nervous, right? I'm going into this conversation and I'm stiff, right? And I'm tight and he's asking me questions and I'm answering questions. And it's very much interview. Well, we're doing this at dinner, okay? And he finally sits back and he says, "Shellye, relax. I know this interview is really just about getting to know who you are." He said, "So, let's start again." Kind of. So anyway, so I got lucky. All right, I got lucky because that could have gone very poorly, and he would have left and thought, "This woman is not ready for prime time," right? But the good news is I had a phenomenal session with the CEO prior. So I know the CEO had probably said, "Hey, I really like this person, blah, 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 blah." So he was trying to find that, right? He was like, "Okay, I'm not seeing it for the first 15 minutes. So let's see if we can actually get there." Anyway, we did. So the good news is it wasn't a fatal situation, but it was definitely a real thing. So that was one. And then fast forward, right? So I was 43 then, or 42 when I was interviewing. So anyway, so fast forward, and I've now just been accepted to the Verizon board, right? And so I'm coming to my first board meeting, and I get ready to walk into the meeting, and I look in, and there's the CEO of Walgreens. There is the former head of the SEC. There is the former Secretary of Transportation, right? I'm like, oh my God, right? Oh my God, how am I going to stand toe to toe with these people? Why are they going to listen to anything I have to say? And all this stuff is just in my mind. I'm literally standing there getting ready to walk in the door. And it was like, "Shellye, get over it. You're going to be fine." Act like you know what you're doing until you do, right? Because the key is we always figure it out. We just have to remember to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. And so I walked in, and anyway, they've obviously kept me around. I've been on the board for over 10 years now.
I love that. It reminds me of the Amy Cuddy TED Talk on power poses. I don't know if you've seen that one where she encourages people to be in the bathroom, raising their hands, saying "I'm the best" before going into those meetings to reverse the chemistry. Brilliant. You actually did talk also in your book about this idea, which I love, that if people didn't think you belonged, they wouldn't have invited you. So even if you don't believe in yourself, believe in them, which I thought was really powerful as a mental model. And you also gave a handful of other tips around sort of overcoming imposter syndrome, which included power dressing, keeping a list of achievements, talking about it, faking it till you make it. I was wondering if you could bring some of those to life with examples of where they have made a difference for you in your board career.
People make first impressions before you even open your mouth. So I needed everything that could help with that. So yeah, that's why the power dressing thing. And even, to this day, I spoke at an Okta. They had a senior leadership, the top 150 executives at the company off-site. And the CEO asked me to come speak, and so I did. And then he got up afterwards and thanked me. And he actually mentioned the dress, because in Silicon Valley, people, jeans, t-shirts, hoodies, right, whatever. I'll wear jeans, but I'll put on a blazer, I'll put on the whole bit. So even on stage, he's thanking me, and he said, "And Shellye's still our best dressed board member." So that's one. And then the one about keeping the list. Frankly, it was my late husband who taught me that. And it goes back to actually getting ready to go into these interviews for Verizon. Yes, I've been serving on Arbitron for 7 years before I got on the Verizon board. But it was like, oh, he's the one who's like, "Shellye." And he's just like, tick, 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 right, in terms of all the things. And yeah, you're right. And that's why I encourage people. I didn't do it. He did it for me. But I think it's really helpful to help you just build that, confidence to believe you can do it. And then, the last one, which is the fake it till you make it. And what I mean by that is fake the confidence. I don't mean act like you know what you don't know. I mean fake the confidence. Because as I was saying earlier, and this one I use all the time, as I was saying earlier, if you think about it, each of you listening, eventually you always figure it out.
Love that. Super powerful. We recently wrote an article about bystander syndrome. So this idea where witnesses won't help a crime victim when they're part of a crowd of onlookers because they don't feel personal responsibility. And it's not until someone points at them and says, hey, you come and help me now, that then a person will come forward and then the whole group follows. And in my experience, board members sometimes don't raise obvious points for similar reasons. And I've seen this in our mastermind groups where people say, well, there's this really obvious elephant in the room and no one else is raising it. So I assume there must be a reason for that. So I'm not going to raise it either. Do you have any tips for boards looking to create spaces in which that sort of mindset, sort of bystander syndrome or imposter syndrome, is minimized for individuals?
Yeah. So one of the exercises that started doing on one of my boards, and it's so effective that I've brought it to other boards, and that is during the exec session, right at the end, you literally go around the room. Instead of doing the general, which is, okay, anyone have a topic for exec session, right? And the chair or the lead director will typically have one or two things throughout and say, anybody else have anything? Instead of doing that, actually it's structured. Go around the room and everyone shares, the 2 or 3 things that excite them as a result of the meeting, right? That they're opportunity, they think they're great, blah, blah. And then 2 or 3 things that they want to learn more about, or they're a little concerned about, or the right. So share 3, 2 or 3. It's not a fixed number. It's kind of what it is. But by doing that, number one, everybody knows they're going to be doing it. So through the meeting, they're kind of jotting down, okay, what are those things, right, that I've got? And then when we go through the wrap up in sharing, everybody has a voice. So it's not like you have to break in. You have a turn. You know it's coming, it's scheduled, and therefore you want to share what's this and what's that. And typically that helps bring out the elephants under the table. So it works very well.
Really love that. Thank you. One last thing I want to talk about before we move on to the lightning round is this idea of swerving that you touched on in your book, where
whole section called swerve.
this idea of accepting when you might not be able to achieve your original goals via your original plans, reassessing and repositioning. And it reminded me a lot of one of my favorite books by Annie Duke called Thinking in Bets. And she's also sort of talked about this concept of knowing when to quit versus the sort of the Angela Duckworth grit. The traditional wisdom is to just keep going and plowing on. Whereas actually Annie Duke talks about the difference between professional poker players and amateur poker players is they're really good at knowing when to fold. They only play 20% of their hands versus 50% of their hands. And I'm curious to hear how you think about that, because a lot of particularly those looking to get their first board role, will often encounter what they perceive as failure in the first attempt. They don't get their first board role, and they're used to having these stellar executive careers. And so sometimes the mindset is, well, what was I thinking? Why did I go for that? Of course, I'm not right for it, and then don't go again. So I'm curious to understand how you think about that, when to swerve, when to quit, versus when to grit.
I do it based upon goal setting and plan. So in setting goals, if the goal is, it can be audacious, but reasonable, because you've done, I say reasonable, meaning you've done the homework and realized, okay, I should be able to go do this. Then keep the goal the same, right? So, a personal example, I wanted to be a CEO. I wanted to be a CEO since I was 16. I joined IBM with the idea of being CEO. And I got to the point after 14 years where I was running a multi-billion-dollar division. My boss reported to Lou Gerster, the CEO. There wasn't anyone higher than me in the organization that looked like me. I was doing well. I progressed well. I was one of the earliest executives named. I was the first Black woman to go on an overseas executive assignment, right? All these things. But there were too many signs that I just felt, I don't think I'm going to get a chance to actually compete for the CEO role. So I could have done 2 things, right? One, well, I'll just give up on the CEO role. No. I still wanted to be a CEO. Maybe I just wasn't going to do it at IBM. So that means change the plan. So keep the goal, change the plan. And so I changed the plan, which said, okay, I'll leave IBM. I'll work my way. I was in tech. Silicon Valley's hot, right? Worked my way to Silicon Valley eventually, and that's where I became in terms of a CEO. So to me, that is a grit thing in terms of the goal is still achievable. I just have to figure out a different plan to get there. Now, sometimes you actually have to change the goal. And that could be because, number one, you decided, you know what, I set that goal, but it's really not what I want to do now that I've gotten closer to it. That happens. Or two, the cost is more. I mean, the cost generally speaking, but that cost is more than you're willing to pay. And that's okay too. Then change the goal. Fold your hand, right? Wait for the next hand. But create and pick a new one so that you're always working towards something.
Brilliant. Shellye, that has been so inspiring. I feel like I need to go back and re-listen to all of this again and take all my notes down. It's time, though, to move on to the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
So first up, the boardroom behavior that irritates you most.
When people go down a rabbit hole for just personal curiosity or to just show how smart they are.
I love that. Best book every board member should read and why?
Think Again by Adam Grant, because he really talks about just broadening our aperture of how we think, digest, and kind of live in the world. And I think that's just perfect for sitting on board.
I love Adam Grant. He's one of my favorite podcasters. Favorite quote and why?
People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. By Maya Angelou.
Your most significant professional insight?
Goes back to calendar. Make sure your calendar reflects your priorities.
Brilliant. And the worst professional advice you have ever received?
Just work hard and things will work out.
And last but not least, 3 things that our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else away.
Number 1, be intentional. It's your career. Own it. 2, and we talked about this, which is pick a major. Be known for something. And then 3 is when you're in the boardroom, remember you're there to support, encourage, and yes, govern management. But you're not giving them a test. Make sure you're doing the right job around supporting them too.
Brilliant. Wow, Shellye, that has been such a privilege. Thank you so much. We spend our time looking at how we can build better boards, and there's some shocking data actually around how great boards can increase the return on resources by, I think it's more than 30%, but fewer than a quarter of execs rate their board as excellent. And it's wonderful seeing and meeting and having the opportunity to talk to someone like you and seeing actually what really great can look like. And I can see exactly why all those boards are so lucky to have you. So thank you so much for taking the time to share all your insights and wisdom with us today. And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.